Okay, just to recap what we did so far. We removed the trowel bases off the models because we're going to introduce some more wax onto the existing setup here. And I've soaked the models for about 10 minutes or so and boiled off any possible wax residue that adhere to the models. So I've removed everything off the models. So now I can reorient the trowel base back onto the cast. You want to ensure that you're holding it down firmly to prevent any wax from getting on the underside of the base. And we're going to start flowing some wax all around. Now, because I'm using a different type of wax here that I mentioned earlier, I want to make sure that the existing wax that I have on there is blended and it's minimized as much as possible. So take the time to go around each tooth. And use a hot instrument and melt the wax a little bit before introducing some more wax onto this. So if you have any blanching of the wax, or possibly we're using wax that was a little bit on the cold side, this is your chance to correct this. Remember, I scraped off the excess wax that was around the periphery from our bite block stage. I've melted that off. I have a bit of a blanching of the wax in here, so I'm going to take a little bit of care to melt that in, because we really want to have a uniform finish and uniform color of the wax. So it appears that it's one piece, to mimic the final acrylic product. Okay, so that looks pretty good. So once again, make sure you pinch the trowel base onto the cast. And just like we did with our bite blocks, we're going to get some wax and start flowing it all around the periphery in small increments. You don't want this wax to overflow, because if it does, it's going to cool off rapidly and you're not going to get a nice adaptation of the wax all around the periphery. The wax that I'm using now to finalize my wax up is a much harder consistency of wax, which I think will provide me with a much finer detail in terms of the carving and contour of the final trowel base. I wouldn't advise you doing this with a font stock, because the font stock is just way too big and you're going to end up picking up way too much wax all at once to apply. So I think the number 7 spatula is just the right size for this, to pick up just enough wax and apply it. Make sure that you heat the wax prior to applying it. So as you're picking it up out of your wax cup, you want to hold it over your flame to heat the wax to get nice, to get the wax to flow nicely. So again, do it in small increments. A little bit back here. I'm continuing to pinch the wax, the trowel base to the model to prevent the trowel base from lifting off the cast. So once I have my initial layer, Now I can continue further up, away from the periphery, but once again, make sure that you have the wax relatively hot so it flows. Make sure that the wax flows into proximately. Be conscious where you put pressure with your hands as you're holding the case. You don't want to put pressure on the teeth. I'm trying to keep my hands away from the teeth because remember, we're adding hot wax to the existing underlying lining wax, and we could possibly move the teeth as the underlining wax softens up, and it will have an effect on our setup. So be aware where you put pressure. Make sure you fill in all the voids completely. And it's important to have a nice blending between each layer of wax. I don't think you'll be able to add the amount of wax that's required for the final wax up or for the try-in, whichever one you're working on, all at once. You're gonna have to go back and do multiple layers. But each layer needs to blend in with the underlining layer uniformly. Continue up here. Make sure that you turn your instrument over and you get in between. So I'm rotating my model in a sense so the wax doesn't flow all over the place. So I have control of the wax depending on the amount of heat that I introduce to it and what it's going to do when I apply it, if it's going to flow or not. See if I can get this to go this way. All right. Always a good idea to take your alcohol torch in between layers of wax. And just give it a gentle flame. And I think it makes it a little bit easier to blend the layers together. Kind of takes the bumps out of the way, so to speak. You might want to shift from the maxillary to the mandibular back and forth. Let the wax cool off a little bit so you're not running the risk of possibly displacing teeth out of the way. So I'll move on to the lower now and get it into position. Make sure it's positioned properly. And it really doesn't matter where you start, just make sure that you have a good sense of where you want to place the wax initially. I'm going to start over here. Flow it all the way to fill in the periphery. Relatively hot wax now to ensure that the wax flows all the way down to the model. Keep your hand on top of it so it doesn't move around or it doesn't lift off the cast. Regardless of the wax that you're going to use to finalize your wax up, the technique is exactly the same. It doesn't change. I'll move on to the facial aspect. And again, just work in small increments. Might want to let the wax cool off a little bit before just moving on to a new section. I think I have enough wax on here that holds the case in place, so I don't have to hold it together anymore. Just make sure that I have a nice flow of wax all the way to the land area to give me the nice rounded appearance of the periphery for the try-in. Okay. So I'll continue with the initial layer. Make sure that the wax flows evenly throughout, especially into proximately, right in here. So I'm kind of turning my instrument over and melting the wax inside the interdental papilla space. Especially with the lower incisors, you will really want to get the wax to flow all the way up to the incisal third of the teeth. Right in here, all the way up here. Okay, move on to the lingual. Introduce some wax in here. Remember, in here we're going to have quite a bit of a depression to accommodate for the lingual concavity. So be aware of that, so not to add too much wax. The more wax you add, the more you have to carve away. Ideally, you should have maybe about 0.5 millimeter to 1 millimeter more than what you need, so you're able to carve it back. I'm not there yet, but eventually we're going to get there. Try to shape the wax a little bit while it's still soft. And make sure, once again, you have a nice flow, especially around the teeth. And don't forget to turn your instrument over and get that wax to flow into approximately to get full coverage of the wax. All the way down to the gland area once again. And I'm going to just smooth this out ever so slightly, not too much heat here, ever so slightly to get it ready for the next layer. So if we compare the wax on the lower now, compared to the wax that I placed on the upper previously, the color looks a little bit different because this has cooled down quite a bit. So I'm going to leave this one on the side now and go back to the upper and introduce another layer of wax on top of the one that I just applied. In order to do this, you have to have a good sense of where you need to finish. And I say that because you need to add a little more wax than what you need to be able to carve it back and contour it properly. So I'm going to add another layer of wax on top of the existing one. And once again, you want to make sure that that layer is relatively hot to get a nice blending between the different layers. So there's no blanching of the wax, there's no voids. Everything looks like one piece. And basically what we're trying to do now is duplicate the finished product, but in wax. Move on to the other side. Now, this being the second layer, or possibly the third, depending how many layers you need to apply your wax, you can be a little more liberal since you have the underlining layer in place. So you can move a little bit faster. But really, it's during this stage that the finished product, meaning the acrylic denture, really takes shape. And if you do it correctly, there's going to be very little trimming and polishing to do on this case, or on any case for that matter. If you get your wax to be reflective of the finished product. I'll go back in here, flow a little more wax in here. And on the palette, you want a very fine layer, maybe about 1/2 millimeter or so, on top of the base plate, just to give it that smooth feel for the try-in. And also to give you to get you to the proper thickness of the palette, which is about 2 to 3 millimeters. Not too much, just a fine layer, providing that you adapted your base plate correctly to the right thickness and you didn't over pinch it or left it too thick. So if you do that correctly and you apply a fine layer of wax, there's very little trimming and polishing to do on top of this area. And this is probably the hardest area to trim after and polish. So even though I'm working with wax, I'm thinking so far ahead as to trimming and polishing the case. So again, with the torch, kind of level things off a little bit. Try not to overwork one area with a torch, because the wax will get too soft on you. Already it's starting to look a little more like a denture. Smooth this side as well. Be careful where you're applying the heat. You don't want to burn the teeth. And make sure that the wax gets all the way to the occlusal and incisal third, so we can carve it accordingly. A little bit more in here. I'm getting closer to where I think I should be, meaning that I'm going to have a little more wax than I need so I can carve it back and contour it. I'm going to leave this on the side and go back to the lower and do the same thing. So I'm going to start off with one side. And make my way around once again. Let the wax cool off a little bit before I rotate my model, otherwise it could flow. Right here, when we get to the corner, to the canines, it tends to flow one way or another, so I'm just going to be a little patient here before I rotate my cast. And don't forget to heat your instrument after you picked up some wax from the wax cup. Make sure you heat your instrument over the Bunsen burner so the wax layers blend nicely to each other and they look like one piece. If you're not sure how much wax you need to add a little more than what you think. It's a lot easier just to carve excess wax away than it is to go back and add, having to wax and carve it again. So maybe just add a little bit more than what you think you need if you're not sure, especially when you first start doing this. Let that cool off a little bit before I move to the lingual side. Now some of this wax that's splattered here, it's not a big deal because remember I soaked the model, so it's not going to stick to the model at all. So you can get it as hot as you want. In fact, I'll flow some really hot wax here. I mean, this is really hot. And you can see the difference in color. But once the wax cools off, and because the models were soaked in water for about 10 minutes, really it doesn't stick to the model. So you can get your wax real hot, especially when you're introducing the wax around the peripheries in here to take the form of the caster. Well, that's not supposed to happen. We're not supposed to get wax on top of the teeth, but if you do, it's not a big deal. We're going to go back and carve it away, and certainly we're going to use a little bit of wax remover to remove it as well. But do your best effort not to get wax on the teeth. Okay, I think I'm getting fairly close. I'm going to add some more around the lingual gingival margins, just to create a bit of a contour around the margins. And some more on this fourth quadrant here. Just going to use my instrument just to smooth this over some of the bulky areas here. And give it a once over with the alcohol torch just to smooth things out. And a little bit on the lingual side. All right, I'm going to let that cool off a little bit, set off to the side, and then bring back the upper and see how everything looks. Before I start carving it, I want to have a good sense that if I have enough wax on there to carve, because I really don't want to go back, having to go back and add wax and having to recarve again. You want to minimize your back and forth. So what I'm going to do, just to give me a better idea if I have enough wax, I'm going to remove the excess wax off the land area here, because it gives me a better sense of the contouring of the wax. Yes, I do have wax overlapping the land area, but we're not going to have any wax overlapping the land area when we finish the case. Initially, when you start applying the wax, you can't help it. You're going to have wax flowing over the land area, but just go back and carve it to give you a better sense of where you're going with this. So I'm going to use maybe a different instrument now, my number 7 spatula, just the tip of it, just to carve it back some more. And it paints a better picture in my mind in terms of the amount of wax that's on there, or possibly I need to add some more if I need to. And definitely I think I need to add a little bit more, especially around the interiors here a little bit. Bit of a carbon debris from a wax cup. Make sure you don't leave that in your wax up. Remember, this is going to go in somebody's mouth, so you want to keep it very clean. And a little bit more around the lingual margins here, as I feel that it's under contoured right now, and I won't have enough wax there to shape it eventually. So I'm just going to add a little bit more. If in doubt, just add a little bit more wax. Doesn't take that long to carve it away. And a little bit more here as well. Okay, I think I'm fairly close, so I'm just going to give it a once over with the alcohol torch, just to smooth out the wax, kind of even out the contour a little bit. And back in here. Try not to be stagnant over one point for too long. Just move your case around. Otherwise, you're going to overheat your wax and possibly move teeth around. So that looks fairly good, meaning that I have enough wax there that it's a little more than I need for the final carving, so I can shape the wax. I'm not going to do it right away. I'm going to let that cool off, and I'm going to go back to the lower. So I'm going back and forth. I'm alternating between the two to make sure that I give the wax sufficient time to cool off, so I don't possibly move teeth around. It's a bit of a void in here. I have to go back and fill it in, but I'll clean up the land area first on the inside as well. Make sure you take advantage of the land area to fill it in completely. We want full length, full width of the periphery with our wax. And everything should be rounded and smooth. Nothing should be sharp or left rough. Clean this up a little bit more. Okay. Just going to take a little bit of care to fill in this void that I have here. And just give it a final look in terms of how much wax that I have on there, and possibly having to add a little bit more. Maybe a little bit more around the canines to duplicate the canine eminence. That looks okay. And possibly a little bit more back here. I know I'm overlapping the land area back here over the rich molar pad, but I'll certainly cut it back after I remove the trial base off the model and give its final contour around the periphery. Maybe a little bit more wax in here. And here. All right, I think I'm fairly close. Just Give it a final flame here with the torch. Just trying to even out some of the layers of wax that I placed on there just to make it a little bit easier for me to carve it. That's all.